My topic today is on microservices in Django, or microservices with Django. My name is Biola Oyeniyi. I am a developer, entrepreneur, co-founder, and so I currently work with two startups. Tutoria is a platform that helps people, that connects people with whatever skill they want to learn with tutors that can teach them, as well as a new one, Career Lift, that helps you um, build beautiful resumes for the job of your dreams. Okay, so I'll be talking about microservices in Django. But we need to get the terminologies right. As in, we're talking about two things, microservices and how they apply to the Django Web Framework. I'm pretty sure the microservice term, we might have heard of it, but I'll just talk about it a little. Microservices is an architectural style that structures an application as a collection of loosely coupled services which implement business capabilities. So what this means is you have as in you build your application in such a way whereby different parts of the application are built as standalone apps. So take, for example, a sample e-commerce application. The authentication part is handled as a standalone service. It's running on its own server, as in it has its own URL, and the only thing on that application, the only thing it handles, the only functionality it handles is anything that has to do with authentication, be it authentication with Facebook or with whatever platform, whatever functionality you want to support. Everything that has to do with authentication is being handled by that particular service. And having something like that across different business requirements for that particular product. So building applications in such a way is an example of how the microservice architecture operates. Now, one advantage of using the microservice architecture is it enables continuous deployment of large complex applications. Because in a microservice architecture, because of the way the applications are structured, as in you can always roll out new features independent of, as in at points when they are ready. So it's because each services are managed as standalone services, they can be deployed independently of each other. New functionalities can be introduced at a much faster pace. Of course, nothing is exactly free in software development. There are its cons. And to find out more about that, the link pasted below talks more about some of the pros and cons of using the microservice architecture. So now we'll be talking about the Django Web Framework. Django is one of the many web frameworks we have in Python. And what makes Django an interesting web framework is because it does certain things well, and it does it well, as in does it in a very unique way and I'll be discussing some of them. So one advantage of using Django is it makes it easy to write better web apps more quickly and with less code. Now, this is something we need to take note of. It makes it easy to write web apps quickly and with less code because Django is a framework. It does a number of things. But based on the problem you have, as in, because Django does this, as in, it does a number of things, you can leverage the functionalities provided by Django in accomplishing whatsoever tasks you need to accomplish at that particular point in time. Also, Django is a high-level Python web framework that encourages rapid development, clean and pragmatic design. So like I said, Django provides a number of things out of the box that you would run into when building a typical web application. And because everything is incorporated in Django, you just key into those features without having to implement it from scratch. And of course, to buttress the previous point, Django takes care of much of the hassles of web development so that you can focus on writing your app without the need of reinventing the wheel. Okay, so like I said, Django offers a number of features. In fact, the question that you could ask is, why would you want to use Django in a microservice architecture? Because it might appear that since Django offers most of all these features, as in it makes sense for a full-blown application. Why a microservice, at least the whole point of a microservice, is to build small, independent applications that function as a standalone application. But Django is not, as in the whole point of Django, Django is not limited to a particular kind of application. It can be adapted to different architecture. And I'm going to be talking about some of the things to consider when using Django in a microservice architecture. Of course, some of the functionalities that you would appreciate more when using Django, I'm going to talk about them. One is the inbuilt scaffolding functionality. Now, when you're working in a microservice architecture, one thing you need to keep in mind is the ability to be able to easily create new services when you need them. Because the way you could do it is you take the time to build a single service, as in think about all the folder structure. Then if you want to build another service that handles a different application, you copy-paste that folder structure, but that can be cumbersome. And Django comes with an inbuilt scaffolding functionality. So if you were to install Django and you run the Django admin start project command, at least it gives you a sensible structure. But you could actually do more with that. As in, Django actually provides a way by which you can point that start project command to a particular template that you could have either locally or it could be on a GitHub repo. And based on the configuration of that project, of course, following particular conventions, you get a structure that matches whatsoever need you want. Now, in my own case, because I wanted a very lightweight Django application, I didn't need most of the functionalities that Django would have provided on the box, and I already configured everything in a single application. I just converted it to a single repo. And based on that repo, anytime I want to install a new service that does something different, but at least has the bare minimum requirements, I just point the management command to this repository and the project is up and running. Now, another interesting feature, which it might sound counterproductive in a way, is the Django admin. Now, one reason to use, one of the characteristics of using Django is because of the fact that it speeds up development. So imagine a startup environment where you are short on developers, but there are a number of things you are working on that you need to get done as fast as possible. At the same time, irrespective of whatever you build, you need an admin interface to be able to, that you can do a little bit of administrative tasks. Django helps with this greatly. Of course, it comes with a caveat. At least the default behavior, as in to be able to leverage the admin, it assumes you are using a relational database as your data store. But it's also possible to actually use Django without a relational database, and at least some work has been done on that. But in a fast-paced environment, with the assumption that all your databases are relational databases, you could actually leverage Django admin. And just the way you need to make use of it, for whatsoever reason, you have your database with existing data, and you want to leverage Django admin. The inbuilt functionality to be able to use Django admin is, of course, it requires some models. But in this case, the way you might be familiar with using Django, you need to create the models, then run the migration file before it creates the information on DB. But in this case now, you have the information in DB, and from the DB, you want to generate the models. Django has a management command known as inspectdb. So running this particular command and rendering the output to wherever you want to store the models, Django generates a model structure from your database. So instead of you having to come up with all the different tables in your DB, it generates everything for you. Of course, the relationship might be a little bit different. But the beautiful thing about the Django model, how Django structures model is, everything is just an abstraction. So you can always edit whatever model Django generates for you and adapt it to whatever use case you might have. Like, for example, now, in a previous app, you might have had a foreign key relationship. But when Django ended up generating it, for some reason, it could just appear as maybe an integer key. Because with an understanding of how the Django model works, there is nothing stopping you from adding a foreign key that points to that particular ID, and you get to get that functionality for free. Okay, so we're talking about some of the Django functionalities that are available that you could adapt in a microservice architecture. So take, for example, a simple login required. Of course, the login, if you are familiar with the Django framework, you know Django comes in with an inbuilt authentication functionality. But like depending on whatever service you might be working on, you might be working on a service that isn't concerned with implementing authentication, that is just focused on a different functionality, e.g. payment. And of course, you need to be able to pinpoint who is authorized to access this particular functionality. So because we're not leveraging the inbuilt functionality of the Django Web Framework, but at the same time, we want to stick with some of the structure in which Django uses. For example, now, the login required. Since the login required function is just a decorator, you can overwrite it and come up with a custom implementation. So in this example below, what I did was wrapping this particular decorator. Of course, the point is to determine if somebody is authorized to view this particular endpoint. The underlying implementation ends up making a call to a third-party service. And based on the response, if the third-party service returns a 403 response, it means the person is not authorized, and the person gets a 403 JSON response instead of, say, the default behavior of redirecting the person to a login page. Because this particular login required endpoint works with a JSON REST API. Okay, so another thing to take into consideration is Django provides a number of functionality, but at the same time, because one of the advantages of working in microservice architecture is you have the ability to be able to, because you are building standalone services, you want to build your application in such a way whereby you can easily adapt based on need. So there are certain things that you might be used to in a Django project that isn't so necessary. And some of them, I'll be talking about them. The app structure. If you were to follow the Django tutorial on the site, as in one of the things that they encourage is to structure applications by apps. Of course, in a way, you could look at that as you plan on building different applications in different apps in a single project. But since now you are working in microservice architecture such that one app, as in you could just imagine an app functioning as the whole project. So you don't necessarily need to build different functionalities in an app. You could just use the default one generated by the scaffold. So you could have just a single file, depending on how large your service is, that consists of all the things you need. You don't need to have, well, of course, there's nothing stopping you from having a urls.py, a views.py, a models.py, but in the case where you're working on a service that doesn't need a model, e.g., a notification service or a mail service, there is no point in having a models.py. In fact, you could even just completely eliminate the views.py and just use a single file, the urls.py, and just stack your code. Also, of course, definitely, another thing Django promotes is the use of shared libraries. So, say for instance, you need to implement a particular functionality, there's a Django-specific app. While you are definitely going to run into scenarios where there are certain apps that solve a particular problem for you. You would want to go with the approach of using just a standalone library, a standalone Python library, so that as much as possible you don't want to, because certain functionalities are going to be shared across different services. And even though you might have started building your services with Django today, depending on requirements, you might have certain services that require, okay, you need to, as in, you need to change it to an async framework in Python or something else. And at the same time, some of those functionalities, you might want to reuse them. So you don't want to make your shared libraries Django specific. You want to make them Python specific. And depending on the functionalities those libraries provide, if initially when you're starting, you are definitely going to have your project-specific code that you might not want to open source. Or there might be some that you want to open source. At least this is a good way to build out those libraries before open sourcing them. And to ensure that those libraries get installed when you eventually deploy your application in production, a production application, you could install them directly from Git. You don't have to you don't have to create a special folder for all the projects. Just put it in a Git repository and let pip do its thing. Because you can one problem you might run into there is for pip to be able to install the particular library, it has to be in a publicly accessible link. So assuming you don't have any production-specific configuration, you could host it in a public repo. But if you are deploying in a controlled environment, because the second suggestion I offer there is not exactly secure, but at least it has the benefit of reading a private repo and installing whatsoever shared app you might have there. Now, these are some opinionated things to think about when working in a microservice architecture. We had a talk earlier where the topic of a mono repo or a single repo per service was discussed on. This is something you have to consider early on because it's something you have to consider early on. Like was mentioned earlier, depending on the size of the project, you might choose a mono repo or a single repo per service architecture. Now, a mono repo doesn't necessarily mean a single app that dispatches all the application. This could literally be just a single repository that consists of all the services, while each of the services could have their corresponding deployment scheme. It's just that you host all the services in a single repo. So that way, for whatever reason, at any point in time, if you need access to a different service that you might not be working on, you don't have to go find what the repo is. You have access to everything online. So depending on the size of the team, depending on the convention of the team, you could choose either of the two. Also, leveraging the ORM instead of depending on third-party apps for basic functionalities. Now, what I mean here is, I don't know, I've been speaking with a number of developers, and when they want to implement a REST architecture, kind of like the Django library they look forward to is the Django REST framework, which does a number of things. At least it comes with an inbuilt serializer. It makes building a REST architecture in Django easy. But this is something that, with a little knowledge of the ORM, you could also get, of course, depending on the size of your project and depending on the requirements they are working on. If you need to just return a simple JSON response that consists of a key value, as in a set of fields on your DB, and you're not so much interested in setting up a serializer, just calling the name of the model .object.values and specifying the fields in the database, you get all the data you want. And by sending it down as a JSON response, you get the same functionality. But like I said, of course, depending on the requirement of the project. If you need more, like for example now, Django REST framework is a good case. If you want to implement some form of authentication, e.g. JSON, as you want to make use of, instead of you want to make use of JSON web tokens, and you don't want to have to build it from scratch. There are libraries that key into the Django REST framework that make that pleasant to work with. Another thing to take into note is the concept of continuous integration and delivery for each of the services. Since each services are deployed independently, you need to set up a system whereby the process of getting the service from development to production is seamless. Of course, continuous integration includes writing exhaustive tests on each of your services, setting up, making use of platforms that make it easy to that makes it easy to implement a continuous integration pipeline. An example of one is one of our sponsors, GitLab. They provide a Docker registry for you for almost for free, and it also comes with an inbuilt CI system where, by deploying your code in a particular branch, based on a particular configuration, it gets to, assuming you have tests, it gets to run the test. Depending on how you structure it, you can actually, from the point of development, after all the tests have passed, it can automatically deploy your code, depending on the platform, to wherever you host your project. Also, the last point to take note is, like I said, one of the strengths of Django is it helps you to build apps as fast as possible. It's a good starting point, but not exactly the end goal. Because once you start a project, you are definitely going to end up customizing it. And the whole point of a microservice architecture is that you want to have that flexibility. So while Django helps you to be up and running, at least to take you to a particular point, you are definitely going to, hopefully, or depending on the traffic you get and depending on new requirements that might come in that might not be accessible at the time when you are building it, you will definitely want to look at other options. And at least, assuming at that particular point, you have more hands on deck, because the service is small, it's going to be easy to be able to switch to something that is much more performant. Thank you.